Knox College, Lombard College, Brown's Business College gave Galesburg the nickname of College City. Living in a college town had its points for us kids. Three of us speaking around here and there one summer morning, just looking to see what there might be to see in the Lombard building, opened the door to the room at the east end of the second-floor hall. There, in a glass case, was the tall human skeleton. Now, we had seen cat, rat, dog, and horse skeletons, but this was our first time having a look at the bones of a human being. His jaw and teeth had a big grin, and it looked like he might have just put the grin on for us, as if saying, "Why do you come in here where I'm having a quiet time for myself?" We spent a while getting acquainted with the skeleton. We had many questions. Who was he? Could he have been a murderer? Who took out his insides and scraped the bones all white and clean? Ain't it funny how that big grin never leaves his face? Would you like to have it at home in your room to talk to when you wake up in the morning? Well, we went around to some of the other exhibits in the room. Glass cases of rocks, 100 species of stuffed birds, but we kept coming back to the skeleton. One kid saying, "He's the champion in this room, all right." Well, we returned on other days to look at the birds and the rocks, but mostly that skeleton. Several times when carrying a 2-gallon can of milk, I met on streets near Knox College a little man who would nod his head to me without speaking, and I would nod my head to him without speaking. Once on Main Street, I saw a man point at him and say to another man, "That fella used to know Abe Lincoln." This was Newton Bateman, sometimes nicknamed Little Newt, the president of Knox College for many years. Little Newt dropped out as president of Knox when he was 70, went on teaching a few college classes while a new president took the chair, John Houston Finley, 29 years old and the youngest college president in the United States. Finley was the first to connect the name of Lincoln with that of Knox College in a big way. The country heard about Lincoln and Knox on October 7th, 1896, when Finley put on an anniversary celebration. I got away from the milk wagon in time to wedge through the crowd for a good look. Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln, made a short speech that afternoon. I puzzled about him and wondered what kind of talks he'd had with his father in the White House, what kind of Secretary of War he'd been in the cabinets of Presidents Garfield and Arthur. In his short speech, he didn't say anything I went away thinking about. One Sunday afternoon, a bunch of us came together in front of the Olson store, most of us about 16 or 17 years of age. We were going to have a photograph made of the bunch. We counted, and there were 12 of us. Someone said, "Then we can show people what the Dirty Dozen looks like." And the name Dirty Dozen stuck. It sounded like we were a gang and went in for gang fights. But the Dirty Dozen never fought another gang, nor did we have fights among ourselves. I had my bitter and lonely hours, moving out of boy years into a grown young man. I can remember a winter when the thought came often that it might be best to step out of it all. After thinking about the different ways of doing away with myself, I would actually come out feeling a little cheerful. The idea came to me like a dawning. If death is what you want, All you have to do is live on, and it will come to you like a nice surprise you never imagined. Well, after that winter, the bitter and lonely hours still kept coming at times, but I had been moving in a slow way to see that to all the best men and women I had known in my life, and especially to all the great ones that I had read about, life wasn't easy. Life had often its bitter and lonely hours. And when you grow with new strengths of body and mind, it's by struggle. I believed there were lives far more bitter and lonely than mine, and they had fixed stars, dreams, and moonsheens, hopes and mysteries worth looking at during their struggles. I was groping. I was to go on groping. I was 19 years old, weighed 142 pounds, nearly a grown man, and I was restless. The jobs I had worked at all seemed dead end with no future that called to me. What came over me in those years, 1896 and 1897, wouldn't be easy to tell. I hated my hometown, and yet I loved it. And I hated and loved myself about the same as I did the town and the people. I knew then, as I knew now, that it was a pretty good hometown to grow up in. I came to see that my trouble was inside of me more than it was in the town and the people. So I decided in June of 1897 to head west and to work in the Kansas wheat harvest. I would beat my way on the railroads and see what happened. I'd be a hobo and take my chances on breaking away from my hometown, where I knew every street and people on every block and farmers on every edge of the town. I would take to the road, see rivers and mountains, every day meeting strangers to whom I would be one more young stranger. The family didn't like the idea. Papa scowled. Mama kissed me, and her eyes had tears after dinner one noon when I walked out of the house. It was the last week in June, an afternoon bright and cool. A little west of the Santa Fe station stood a freight train waiting for orders. The conductor came out of the station and waved a yellow flimsy in his hand. As the train started, I ran along and jumped into a boxcar. I started moving and working. I worked passage on a steamboat from Fort Madison to Keokuk. I brushed asphalt on rusty stoves, worked as a waiter in a lunch counter on the 4th of July. I worked on a railroad section gang at Bean Lake, Missouri. Washed dishes in Kansas City and Omaha. I traveled by hopping freight trains, slept in boarding rooms and flea-bitten flop houses, try saying that sometime, in the open when I had to. I harvested wheat in Kansas, saw Pikes Peak so I could say I saw it, and in the cities and towns and hobo jungles of that trip, I was learning a new kind of education. Over 2,000 miles of it. I went home in October to Berrien Street. What had the trip done to me? I couldn't say. It had changed me. I was easier about looking people in the eye. When questions came, I was quicker at answering them or turning them off. I'd been a young stranger meeting many odd strangers, and I had practiced at having answers. At home and among my chums of the dirty dozen, they knew I'd changed, but they could no more tell how than I. Way deep in my heart now, I had hope as never before. Struggles lay ahead, I was sure. But whatever they were, I would not be afraid of them. On the night of February 15th, 1898, I went to bed at 9:30. I was asleep at 9:40 and still asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. That was when President McKinley in Washington heard that the battleship Maine had blown up in Havana Harbor with 260 dead and the ship settled to the harbor bottom. President McKinley declared war on Spain, and I was sworn into Company C, 6th Infantry Regiment, Illinois Volunteers on April 26th. The company needed a dozen recruits to fill out its quota, and I was among the earliest. 10 of our company were Knox students, and 2 were from Lombard. Some 20 or more were farm boys. At least 20 had had fathers, uncles, or near kinsmen in the Civil War. We trained at Springfield, then went to Virginia for more training. In July, we climbed aboard the freighter Rita, bound for Cuba, where the fighting was. But after a stop in Guantanamo Bay, we went on down to Puerto Rico, landing there July 25th. The August tropic heat came on, and mosquitoes. Now, these were mosquitoes of the type you can say 1 could kill a dog, 2 could kill a man. They were large, ravenous, pitiless. They came with bugles blowing mess calls. It rained a lot, too. We heard some shooting one night, but never saw any, nor did any of our own. Our major action came one night when one of the bullocks that pulled one of our carts came blundering through the place where we slept and stepped on a man. He yelled, others took up the cry, and suddenly hundreds of men rushed headlong through the night. Later, we called it the First Battle of Bull Run. As for history, Theodore Roosevelt summed it up in a speech. He happened to mention the Spanish-American War and added with a chuckle and a flash of his teeth, "It wasn't much of a war, but it was all the war there was." Well, after the peace protocol was signed, we came home by way of New York City and were mustered out in Springfield. When our train pulled into the Burlington station at Galesburg on September 21st, we'd been gone only 5 months, but we looked like we'd been somewhere. My brother Mart said, "Well, you didn't get killed, did you?" "No, they didn't give me a chance." "Well, what did you learn?" "I learned more than I can use." "Well, last year you was a hobo, and this year a soldier. What's next with you?" "Maybe I'll go to college." "College? That'll be something." In nearly every life come sudden little events not expected that change its course. Private George Longbrake of Company C, whose backyard on Brook Street touched our backyard on Berrien, had spoken to me about my going to Lombard, where he'd been a student for a year. He asked whether I would enter as a student if they would give me free tuition for a year. I said yes. So after all the cheering and the church banquets were over, he came to me saying the arrangement had been cheerfully made at Lombard. Then came Whiz Brown, saying there was a fire department job open. The department had 2 call men. They slept at the department at night and in the daytime listened when the fire whistle blew and was heard over the town. They went to a telephone, and if it was a big fire, they bicycled to it as fast as their pedals would take them. The call man was paid $10 a month. "That's nice money, Cully," Whiz said. "And I'm sure if I speak to Mayor Carney, he'll appoint you." Well, Mayor Carney appointed me. I bought a bicycle and a fireman's blue shirt and began sleeping on the 2nd floor of the Prairie Street Station House. We were 16 men sleeping in one room. Alongside each iron-framed bed was a pair of rubber boots with pants. And when the alarm bell rang, we stepped out of bed, pulled up the pants, ran the slide down a brass pole, and hopped on the chemical wagon or the hose cart. Each man had 2 or 3 hours of work a day sweeping and scrubbing floors, shining the brass poles, the brass knobs on the harness, the brass chemical tank, grooming the horses, cleaning the stalls, and saddle soaping all leather. The family had moved into a house across the street from the one where we had lived over 20 years. Here, everybody had more room. My room for books and study, or for sitting and thinking about nothing in particular to see what would happen, was at the end of a hall. It was about 5 feet wide and 8 feet long, with a table at a window looking on Berrien Street, the branches of a tall, noble tulip tree almost touching the window. For nearly 4 years, that was my workroom. There I smoked endless pipes of tobacco. There I made notes with a lead pencil, wrote letters and college papers with a stub steel pen dipped into a bottle of Waterman's ink. There, when no college events or odd jobs were doing, I worked Saturdays, Sundays, and evenings from about 6:30 to 10 o'clock when I'd get into my fireman's uniform and go downtown to the fire station. Well, Lombard was strictly a small college, averaging 150 to 170 students. As a boy, I'd walk barefoot over all sidewalks, paths, and corners of its 13-acre campus. Every pine in the clump at the southwest corner was a friend of mine. So was the big elm a few steps north of the front door of the main building. I'd walk barefoot along every hallway and into every room. And in that wonderful little museum on the second floor, I had mocked at the tall, grinning skeleton while he mocked back at me. Now, as a student in this year of 1898, I was to learn close up what went on in classrooms. I had to leave class when the fire whistle blew, but that wasn't often enough to bother either the class or the professor. I was going to get an education. I remember Lottie Goldquist saying you could never get enough of it. So I went to college and learned what it is they do at colleges. I learned about professors. How many kinds there can be of professors. One professor had many facets, angles, windows. He taught mathematics and astronomy. And in English and American literature, he knew more than anyone on the campus about creative writing and how to get it out of the students if they had it in them. In no other class did I see such keen interest, such lively faces, and hear such independent opinions and ideas spoken. I saw students grow in writing, some of them flowering under the guidance of Professor Philip Green Wright, M.A. I had 4 years of almost daily contact with him and visited with him in later years as often as possible. And there was never a time when he didn't deepen whatever of reverence I had for the human mind and the mysterious workings of a vast universe. College was more than what went on in classrooms. I found myself editing and writing on the college paper, speaking orations in contests, playing roles as an actor in college plays, debating and experimenting in parliamentary procedure in the Aristotelian Society, waltzing and two-stepping at the assembly dances, every day having fellowship with young men and women who were a stimulus to me. Women? I fell in love, not deep, but I fell several times and then fell out. I would be smitten with a girl, and after a while I would find out I wasn't smitten anymore. And the thing to do when you're no longer smitten is to call it off. Calling it off comes easy enough if you haven't told the girl you're smitten with her. When you get in deep enough, you have to talk about either the future or maybe a wedding. And who was I to be thinking about marriage when my future was so misty? So I managed to cut out the strolling, stayed away from assembly dances, spoke my hints about my vague and uncertain future. I remember in the last weeks of Lombard stepping into the second floor museum to stand before that tall, elegant human skeleton. I seemed to hear a low and thin whisper as it as its jaw dropped ever so slightly. "Whither goest thou?" And I whispered back, thin and low, "I can't tell you, but I'm sure you would if you could tell me." Then I tiptoed out. You see, I have always been respectful, even reverential, in a room where you can look a human skeleton in the eye sockets. But where was I going? These jobs, contacts, activities, what were they doing to me? Was I growing or getting anywhere? I believed I was, though I couldn't say how or wherein. I was happy, yet restless, with an endless unrest. What was going on inside of me? What was I headed for in the big world beyond the college days? I puzzled and wondered about it till I actually enjoyed the puzzlement and wondering. I was only sure that in the years ahead I would read many books and I would be a writer and try my hand at many kinds of writing. It was about this time that my brother Mart heard me say, and went around quoting it, "I'm either going to be a writer or a bum." By now, Mart was with the Adams Express Company and had charge of a car from Chicago to Galesburg. One night he said he'd been busy in Galesburg politics and he could get me into the Brook Street fire station, 3 blocks from our home, at $75 a month. "What you want is plenty of time to read and write," said Mart, "and you can do that in the fire station. All you have to do is take care of 2 horses, less than 2 hours a day, and the rest of the times you're free, unless there's a fire." Well, an average of 2 hours work a day I had at the Brook Street fire station. The rest of the time, free to do whatever I wanted to do, while of course staying at the station in case of a fire alarm. I wrote poems and articles in my corner of the Brook Street station. I was interested in seeing them in print. One of my friends became city editor of the Galesburg Evening Mail and printed my inklings and idlings when I had a batch of them. I wrote editorials for the Galesburg Labor News, unsigned, but in print. Professor Wright, with the help of his wife Betty and one of his boys, sat the type and did the press work on a book distinctively original in design, type, and binding. It was titled "In Reckless Ecstasy," and it was my first bow to the great American public as an author. I bought a second-hand typewriter at $15 and sent typewritten poems to magazines. I sent a batch of free verse poems to a Chicago magazine called Tomorrow, and they printed 3 of the poems, with a foreword saying, "Charles A. Sandburg is a young man unknown to fame, but if one may judge by the few poems he has written, he will not remain long in obscurity when once his quality is appreciated." Well, I sent them more. Poems, articles, smart aleck philosophizings, portraits or studies of famous men. All were printed. About every other day, I drove 2 big fire horses back and forth along Brook Street for exercise, hauling the combination chemical hose cart with ladders. On the seat one afternoon, I decided that after these 8 months as a fireman and writer, I would go to Chicago and try my luck. So I rode with Mart in the express car to Chicago. I looked up the publisher and editor of Tomorrow in a faded and run-down Prairie Avenue mansion. He offered me board and room without salary to help at editing, proofreading, and handling manuscripts. I had taken the plunge. I was born on the prairie, and the milk of its wheat, the red of its clover, The eyes of its women gave me a song and a slogan. Here the water went down, the iceberg slid with gravel, the gaps and the valleys hissed, and the black loam came, and the yellow sandy loam. The land and the people hold memories, even among the anthills and the angleworms, among the toads and wood roaches, among gravestone writings rubbed out by the rain. They keep old things that never grow old. Oh, Prairie Mother, I am one of your boys. I have loved the prairie as a man with a heart shot full of pain over love. The prairie sings to me in the forenoon, and I know in the night I rest easy on the prairie arms, on the prairie heart. Good night and goodbye.